Hi, it's John Kelly. In this module, we are going to discuss using the audit checklist. And as always, we want to be efficient and effective, follow professional standards, and document what we have done properly. And this module will show you how all of those three things can be accomplished by using the audit checklist. And this will also be useful for training staff if you're using the forms and want staff to understand how to do it. This module will help with that too. So 4 topics: the big red X, clearing the big red X, which is the third thing we'll talk about. Have to complete this form annually, and then a brief review of the sections and what's covered in this checklist. Now the big red X indicates that the checklist is incomplete. There's also a statement that says checklist incomplete, and that means that something is wrong and it needs to be fixed. If you complete all the lines in the checklist, then that completes or removes the big red X. And the purpose of this is to know that, logically at least, all of the steps and all of the boxes are filled out and initialed. You will note on the checklist that there is a yellow exclamation point, and completing the line successfully turns the yellow exclamation point to a green check. And when you clear the very last line, then the big red X will disappear. And at the end, there is a total of cleared and uncleared. So it'll say however many are cleared and however many are uncleared. And you'll be able to figure out how many you got to go find to clear. Form has to be completed annually. I wondered if there was some way that we could have this form carried forward, but this is really a long list of things that professional standards requires us to document that we've done every year. So I just don't see how this can be done other than completed annually. And it's kind of long, but really it doesn't take that long to fill out. So how we clear a line. And before I talk about that, I want to talk about the purpose of a checklist. And the first purpose of a checklist is to remind us of what professional standards require. We're supposed to do something, consider something, document something. So it's just to remind us of that. And it would be really nice if completing the checklist step, yes, I did this, would be all the documentation required. And many times professional standards say the auditor should consider, and documentation of that, I guess, can be no more than, well, I considered that. Yes, I did. I thought about that. Now, clearly more may be needed, and where, in my judgment, it was obvious that more was needed, there's a gray box, and you have to fill out the gray box and provide something additional. And it's up to the reviewer to determine whether or not that additional comment is satisfactory or not. And as an overriding comment on all of the checklist, you know, there are going to be some times when something else is needed, and you're just going to have another working paper and maybe make a handwritten reference on the form to say, you know, I was supposed to consider this, but it turned out to be more complicated than I thought, and here is a much longer story of how I considered this issue. In 99 out of 100 audits, I considered it, nothing was there, and you drove on. But in the 1 or in the 1 in 1,000, then there was something additional. Well, more may be needed, and if that's the case, write something down in the file. Now, there are several types of questions. All require an initial, and there's a drop-down box, a drop-down menu, and on the configuration page you will put in the names and initials of everybody working on the file. And so when you click on the drop-down box or menu, you can click on the required initial. And once you put the initial in, the date comes in automatically. Anytime there's a gray area, you have to complete it, either in the checklist if there's enough room, or by reference to a working paper. So, for instance, this is the very first question on the checklist, and obviously the first question on the checklist has to be to document materiality. It's a little bit of a question because it provides some guidance from professional standards on how we are to determine materiality, and reminds us that we have to determine both materiality and performance materiality. So there's a box there, so that's been completed with initials, and the date popped in automatically. There's a gray box because probably we want to document just a little bit about how we determined materiality and how we determined performance materiality, And so that's been written in the gray area, and that clears the box and we have a green tick. Also require partner approval of this, so there's the place where the partner has clicked and documented their approval of the materiality calculation. So once that's done, planning of the audit can begin in earnest. There are some other examples where there is text already in the gray area to prompt proper completion, and an example of that is question DIS1. You have to update that and fix it and make it appropriate, so you can't just leave the standard text in there. But to give you kind of a hint as to what you might probably say, some text is sometimes already in the gray area. Here are some other example questions. These are two risk assessment questions. The first one is we're supposed to do some analytical procedures, and we did, and to document that we did that, we just tick on the yes. These will also probably be documented on the audit programs. So if we've clicked on the yes and there's a drop-down menu for the X there, initialed and the date comes in, and a green tick. Now the second one is risk assessment procedure is observe entity activities and operations, and you might conclude that that was not applicable. We didn't need to do it in the circumstance, or you might say, well, I did that, I observed it, and anything I noted I would have documented on the crux form. In this case, though, we've initialed it, we've dated it, we've ticked them both off, and that's wrong. We did one or the other. So the logic in the form will not allow the step to clear. We still have the yellow exclamation point, and we're going to have to decide which of those two X's we are to delete. Now, another observation, the purpose of the risk assessment procedures is to identify a risk of material misstatement. And any time we identify a risk of material misstatement, we must describe our response. When 315 and 330 tell us we have to do that. So, I don't want to start identifying risks of material misstatement in my documentation of my risk assessment procedures. I will just say I did my risk assessment procedures, and any risk of material misstatement that I identify, I want to document only on the crux form, because the crux form in the audit program generator is where I am going to provide that linkage to my response. So don't want to identify risks randomly throughout the file, want to identify them only on the crux form. And there's some real risks to random risk identification throughout the file. First of all, you got to describe a plan to address it, and if you don't, you've not satisfied standards. Second, you have to link procedures done to the risk identified. And so they're just a really, really bad idea, because the odds are you're going to identify something in the file, but because you don't put it on the crux form, you don't do any audit procedures, and then sure enough, whatever the risk you identified is going to turn out to be a real problem, and someone's going to come and look at your file because you've missed the problem, and then they go, well, wait a minute, right here in your risk assessment procedures, you identified that as a risk of material misstatement, and then you didn't do anything about it. And boy, are you going to feel bad about that. So do your risk assessment procedures, identify risks of material misstatement, but put them on the crux form so you can then respond to them. Here's another example of a procedure. As a risk assessment procedure, we're required to know what kind of investments the entity is planning to make, and probably the most common answer will be none, so we'll tick off none and initial it. If there was a planned investment, gonna build a new building or something, click off notes and refer to a working paper, or refer to the crux form where you go, they're planning on building a new building and we should, as part of our fixed asset section, do something about that. Here's another question. Too many possible answers to this, so you're going to have to fill in the gray area. The entity carries on the following kind of business. So in this case, it's a retail store. So unless you fill out that gray box, even if you initial it, you won't get the green the exclamation point to go away until you fill out the gray box. A couple of other ones which are hopefully self-documenting. These are documentation of the application of professional skepticism. I emphasize the importance of discussion of matters at all times. The partner did that, so they initialed it and documented that they did it that way. The second step, same thing, you would initial it, but it hasn't been, so the yellow exclamation point is still there, not complete yet. So when you're reviewing the checklist, the first thing you want to do is see that there's no big red X. It means that all the boxes are complete and all the gray areas are filled out. And now the reviewer can focus on, are those appropriately filled out? Do they in fact refer to a working paper? Does the working paper they refer to contain the kind of evidence and documentation that is required? And second, what the reviewer is doing is, if there is some indication of risk of material misstatement, has that been properly documented on Crux and addressed in the audit programs? Now, there are a variety of sections, just to let you know what is covered in the audit checklist as opposed to the audit program, the second audit package. So materiality, planning discussions, documentation of who and when that occurred, documentation of risk assessment procedures, documentation of skepticism, documentation of the consideration of fraud factors, planning completion checklist. Have we done all the things that standards require us to do in the planning section? Section on audit of disclosures. Section on audit completion. Now we've completed the audit. Have we now done all the things we're supposed to do to complete the audit? There are some things that professional standards tell us that the practitioner must do to review the file, and so there's documentation of that. Documentation of our consideration of the control environment. Documentation of client continuance, which has to occur annually, so it has to be completed out every year. And documentation of independence, threats, and safeguards, another annual thing that we have to think about and document. So that, and thanks for listening.